Welcome to Climify, the podcast that connects climate scientists and design educators together so that we can help combat our climate crisis in our classrooms. The discussions on this program are geared to help you climify your syllabi to assign projects that not only teach design fundamentals, but also can have a positive impact on our climate.
This episode is brought to you by Renourish. Renourish is your one-stop online resource for sustainable design and systems thinking strategies and tools for the graphic designer. You can learn more about Renourish on their website at renourish.org, or you can follow them on Twitter and Facebook at Renourish.
I'm Kate Yoder. I work as a staff writer at Grist, where I write about climate change with a focus on language, culture, and history. And you can learn more about this work at grist.org, or you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is Kate M. Yoder.
This past spring, Grist Magazine reached out to me over email, introducing me to the work of Kate Yoder. They felt like she would be a great guest for season 2 of Climify. She wrote a lot about climate action. She wrote about climate anxiety, amongst many things. And when I looked at some of the links they sent, I realized I had read Kate Yoder's work before. I really appreciated it, actually. So I had a Zoom call with Kate prior to recording this particular interview, and we hit it off, and she agreed to be on the show. So I'm pretty excited to introduce you to Kate Yoder. I hope you enjoy my interview. Well, welcome, Kate. Thanks for joining me today on the show. Happy to have you here. I've been a fan of Grist probably since I started working in sustainability around 2004, I think. You guys have been around since 99, is that right?
Yeah, 99.
Yeah, so I've been reading not just your stuff, but other writers' stuff on that blog. It's not just a blog, but online magazine. For many years now, it's been a big influence in my work.
Oh, that's great to hear. Yeah, thanks for having me on. Grist definitely used to be more of a blog, but it sort of transitioned into a more serious journalistic endeavor in recent years.
I remember it being more of a blog, but as the years have gone on, I've noticed, this has really progressed. There's been a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, and I joined in 2015, which was, it was still like the heart of Blog Town. And so It's been really fun to be at Grist over those years. And as I've grown as a journalist, I've seen the whole organization kind of go in that direction too. So it's been really exciting.
So why did you choose journalism? How did you get into journalism, and why do you write about climate?
Yeah, that's a great question. My background is in writing and visual art. So I guess sort of fitting for a design podcast, but
what kind of visual art did you do?
Well, I do watercolor, mixed media, sort of almost like inspired by collage, or sometimes with I've taken apart tea bags and plastered them on watercolor paintings, and just these sort of multi-layered sort of nature inspired, pieces. And, I've done ceramics and other things over the years, but more recently watercolor.
Fine arts and studio art seem to be your passion.
Yeah.
And nature too, because you said nature was a part of your art.
Yeah, I sort of have, it's hard to describe, but I do these paintings of almost disembodied chunks of animals that are split across the page. And it has a lot of white space, and I don't know, it's I don't even know how to describe it. I can send you a picture if you want.
I'd love that, actually. Do you have it online anywhere too?
I have some on private Instagram accounts, but I think I have a couple on that I might have, but I can just send you some photos afterward.
We won't send them to your private Instagram account because it's private for a reason, right?
Yeah.
But your major was in journalism, was that true?
Yeah, well, it was in English writing, technically, and a double major in visual art. And in general, I always wanted to have a creative job. I definitely need to be making things. That's sort of, where I'm happiest. Mm-hmm. And I had this opportunity to intern at Grist in 2015, which was really interesting for me because I had this growing interest in environmental issues, especially over the course of college. And, I noticed that interesting, all of my friends are environmental science majors. Maybe there's something there. And so by the end of college, I was really looking for a chance to use writing, which was sort of, one of my strongest skills and one of the things I was really interested in like around environmental issues. And so I had this opportunity to intern at Grist, and was like, this is sort of like, I'd taken a couple journalism classes in college and that sort of thing, but I didn't think of it as like a super creative endeavor. But Grist had this like sense of humor and this like unique perspective. And so I was like, wow, this is like a chance to learn about journalism and environmental issues, and also like work on, what I consider to be one of the most pressing issues of our time, climate change, especially, looking at like the long term of where the world is heading and like how we'll look back on this moment. So yeah, I found that I actually like journalism. I never thought I was actually like heading in that direction, but I really appreciated the chance to do like magazine style features and, kind of identify trends that are happening that maybe, kind of go unnoticed or people don't really think about them that much. And just research and writing, I pay a lot of attention to details and language. So that's sort of how I got started.
Do you have a favorite piece you did?
Most recently, I did this feature, I call it True Cost, but essentially what it's looking at is how people started talking about climate change as an economic problem. So the gist of it is that, in the early 90s, fossil fuel companies and, other industry started paying economists to do these studies that would look at climate change policies that were being proposed and look at how much is this going to cost the economy. So they would look at it and say, like, this will cause a 2% dip in GDP by like 2011 or something like that. And then, these economic analyses were really, really focused just on the costs, and they didn't look at, the benefits of taking climate action or like the costs of heating up the planet, where you have like disasters unfolding in agriculture and stronger hurricanes and, all these things like across the world that have like a huge economic toll.
Oh yeah.
So my piece was looking at like the ways that, we still talk about climate change, especially in politics, as like something that's going to cost our economy, and politicians are always considering the cost of it and not looking at this flip side, and how like economists are trying to fill in those gaps and, tell a truer story about what the costs of climate inaction are.
Yeah, I kind of feel like with that, that politics really isn't going to be leading the way on climate, that it seems to be like the other green will change a lot of people's hearts and minds in the business sector, insurance sector. Like, we can't insure these Florida homes down there anymore.
Right.
And, yeah. Is that something that you uncovered when you were writing that?
I don't know if I focused specifically on that in the story, but I do think there's sort of a feedback loop that happens where it is like, business interests can definitely drive change, often like a little bit later than maybe everyone wanted, but
right. A little bit slow.
Yeah. But that's definitely something that politics, as we know today, responds to.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering, you're, as a writer and an artist, which I consider myself as well, I find the writing process to be a little bit like the creative artistic process. Do you have the kind of a similar process for both, or are they very different?
That's a great question. I think there's definitely similarities. Like, you have to have some kind of starting point. And the art that I work on is very process oriented. So I'll like sort of have some ideas of elements that I want to include, but it changes as I like put it together and, see what pieces fit where and like make sure the balance is correct. And there's definitely a similar thing with writing where I take an idea and I investigate it and it goes in like a direction I probably didn't expect. And then I like somehow have to sit back and make, this article that I've written some cohesive whole that actually makes sense to people and has like all the right like spices in the right places to keep people interested, but also, the balance of like facts and other things. So, I could see it. I could see my articles as like a composition, but they're definitely not as visually appealing unless our graphic designer comes in and like works some magic.
Oh yeah, then it's all gorgeous on the screen.
Yeah.
I think so there's some, I think, some similarities there. Like I think a lot about both before I start them. So I find that being a designer before I was a writer helped me become a better writer, because I'm okay with the unknown, like the messiness of writing sometimes, where like you said, I don't know where this is going, but let's see.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. That's a personal interest of mine. And I want to talk more about your writing actually as we go on today. But I'm wondering, with the journalism that you do, have you seen an impact of that journalism on the readers? Do you have anyone reach out to you? Have you seen changes out in the world based on the things that you've been reporting on?
Yeah, I mean, definitely hints here and there. I sometimes think of journalism as like I'm sending my articles out into the void and I don't really know what happens with them. So, I mean, there's definitely, it's like people are sharing things on social media, but knowing what we do about social media right now, like sometimes it started to feel a little bit emptier to me.
I agree on that.
Yes. So I think one of my favorite things is just, people, like even sources who I start talk to, or people messaging me individually. There's, sort of this sense of, they'll say like, the story really made an impact on me, or like I'm donating to Grist because one of my articles, like, one of Kate's articles spoke to me in some way. And I've talked to academics who, are using my articles in college courses.
Great.
Yeah, one time one professor told me the story I wrote about like the rhetoric of how we talk about science and politics had been like the impetus for one of their students' like thesis projects. So yeah, like every once in a while I get these like a hint of how these things are, being interacted with by people. But I mean, one of the realities I think of being in journalism is that you don't always know like how a piece you write gets used or who it affects. And I mean, that's okay. Like, I don't have control of it after it's in the world, but it does feel a little bit sometimes like there's like a lack of response because I just don't know how people are interacting with it.
Well, I think many of the educators listening to you will understand what you're talking about, or empathize with what you're saying there, because I think with teaching, it's a very similar thing. There's not that instant gratification of the student at the end of class thanking you profusely for making their mind grow, but maybe a couple years later, out of your control, they'll send you a nice email saying, "Oh my gosh, so happy that you were my teacher," right? You don't know if you're doing any good, right? I mean, a lot of times you're met with blank stares in the classroom. Like you say something that you think is really profound and like, gosh, a lot of time was invested in this. And students, looking at their phone or...
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting that you talk about instant gratification, because that is kind of what it is, right? We're like seeking validation from people. But that's
especially
what
on social media, right? If you're putting your stuff on social media, it's like, how many likes did you get?
Yeah. Now, sometimes if I like tweet something that actually a lot of people are interacting with, I'm like, maybe that wasn't a great tweet because, like I know the things that spread on social media are like outrage and like things that get people's emotions worked up. And like, maybe I should just stick with like the, 3 people liked this and it was just my friends.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe they just clicked on the link and read it as opposed to having to retweet it and like it or comment on it.
Yeah.
Right. You don't want to necessarily become Twitter famous.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. My dad had this philosophy. It was part of his parenting philosophy, but he always said, he wouldn't say that he was proud of us. He would say like, "Oh, you should be proud of yourself for the work that you've done."
Yeah.
So at the time I was like, "Come on, Dad, like just say that you liked this." But no, he was like making sure that was coming from an internal space.
Right. Like you aren't seeking the approval of somebody else, that you're doing it because you care about it. Yeah. I like that. It's a good parenting advice. As a parent myself, I should take that on.
Dad's wisdom.
It is. It's good wisdom with the work that you're doing at Grist. especially on climate. Have you found any particular issue or way of writing or storytelling that seems to connect with the reader or the public the most?
Yeah, I cover a fairly broad issues. One that I found really resonates with people is culture. So I write these culture stories that are sometimes related to, like books that have come out or, popular shows. I often find like popular Netflix shows, like people are really into this.
Right.
But I am totally. Yes. Yeah. So last year I did sort of like a climate change analysis of Bo Burnham's Inside, like his depressing comedy special, where he made all these references to climate change throughout. And I was like, is Bo Burnham joking about the climate apocalypse or not? So a lot of people were really interested in that, at least in terms of like views and how long people read the story. I wrote a piece about the Great British Baking Show a couple years ago, because I know it's like so soothing to watch, right? Until you like see how all of their desserts are melting because they're like, baking these things outside in 100-degree temperatures. Right, yeah, and so I did this analysis of, just like, casual analysis of, how temperatures in the UK, like summer temperatures had increased, and was like, global warming is ruining the Great British Baking Show for me, because all I can feel is like stressed out about all these like ice cream desserts that are turning into disasters in these heat waves. Yeah.
I like that. It's the people have kind of strange tastes or values sometime about like what's important to them, and maybe you can connect with them on climate with these kind of obscure connections, like you're saying. I have found that too. I did something in the past where I connected the idea of systems thinking and sustainability as part of that to The Mandalorian, where I was always quoting lines from the Disney Plus show, The Mandalorian, like, this is the way, right? And in hopes, and I don't know, like, I didn't get any great fan mail about it, but in hopes that it's connecting other things that people care about to a very important topic, so that maybe to keep that other thing that they care about going, they invest their time in some climate action, maybe.
Right. Yeah. I don't finish culture stories and think like, this is going to change the world, when I write about like the environmental impact of Twilight series and like how it changed Forks, Washington, and like the history of logging there. But I do think it's an interesting connection for people. And one of the other themes that I found, maybe on like a slightly more serious note, that resonates with people is the idea of like responsibility in the environment. I've written a few stories about like the idea of the carbon footprint and where that came from, and how, it was used by the oil industry at some points to kind of deflect attention from, like the huge emissions that they were causing. And they're like, well, look at your individual carbon footprint. Or as I mentioned earlier, like the true cost of economics, that piece is sort of about that too. Like, does economics have responsibility to, frame these issues in like a more balanced way, where they're accounting for all of these like costs of climate change that are getting ignored? And then I've even written like a piece or two about the plastic crisis and just, who's responsible for that. Like, we focus so much on littering and like what people are doing with their plastic bottles, that we're overlooking like, well, most of this plastic can't even be recycled. And, how is it that companies are producing all of this and no one's like, not no one, but that's not getting as questioned as much.
Yeah.
So there's all these narratives we've created around responsibility that I think are like invisible to a lot of people unless they're pointed out. So I think those have resonated with people too.
Yeah, it aggravates me, like that type of thing where I'm getting blamed for something I didn't create, right? It's
right.
If I want to enjoy life more, right, I might buy this, but I didn't ask for it in this plastic bottle. It's just how it is. But the companies sort of shirk their responsibility onto us to take care of it.
Right. And it's not like, oh, I don't have any individual responsibility. It's just that
Of course, right.
it's like, because that, narrative is like so widely understood, I think people feel like they have to push back against it to like, kind of even things out. And then in pushing back against it, it becomes this like either this or that, when it's like responsibility is like spread everywhere in different amounts. And we just need to like, we don't need to just point fingers. We need to like find better ways of structuring society and living our lives. Yeah.
And thinking about that, of course, designers make things, design educators teach designers how to make things. And I think there's a certain power and responsibility that designers have here. At the same time, like they're working for a client, they're working for a company or an agency, and they're being asked to create things that are littered or in our oceans or clogging the landfill. And that education in the design classroom might be kind of a misshapen cog in the machine in the future, where maybe we can be part of like the change and knowing more, right? If we know more, we can be that sort of liaison between the client and the manufacturer to say, let's not use this. That's not good. But yeah, we have to know it first, right?
Right. And I worked on this piece last year that some like psychologists and behavioral scientists had come up with this idea of subtraction. They called it subtraction, but there was a paper in Nature about it. And essentially it's the idea that, people will overlook the option of like getting rid of elements. And instead they'll like want to add new ones. There's sort of that impulse behind like, build back better, right? It's
right.
From a design standpoint, we're always thinking of like, how can we improve things? And there's like, well, you're forgetting about the easiest option, which is we can just take these things away.
Right.
So yeah, some of the people I spoke to for that talked about, like as far as climate change goes, like we could be removing highways, we can take cars out of like city centers and redesign them around, other interests like, people, or, seawalls or concrete pavement. Like these are things that are not, maybe could be replaced by, like more natural features that are more like sponge-like, that can absorb water, and, trees and dunes on coastlines and all these things that are, so there's a sense of, I think also like thinking about what we can take away that sometimes gets ignored.
I think so too. And I relate it back to I think it was my like first year in art school, where I learned that I could draw with an eraser by taking away, right? And that kind of stuck with me. And so I've always been kind of interested in that idea of reduction or removing. So that's inspiring to me to think about it at a grander scale. Like, let's not build a new building to solve this problem. Let's remove something from the landscape to solve the problem.
Yeah, it was the idea for subtraction actually came from one of the researchers I talked to, was like playing Legos with his son, and was, they were going to build a bridge or something like that. And he like turned around to grab a piece to put on top. And then he realized like his son had already fixed the problem by just taking off a block. It's like, whoa, I hadn't thought of that. Like, I wonder if there's something here where like people's brains are, predisposed to add things instead of taking them away. So
I think so, because I think we're fascinated with, wow, look at what I can do, right? And I made this. It's a new thing, as opposed to like what you described, like I removed this one thing and solved the problem.
Right. Yeah, it's almost similar to what we were talking about with social media, where like everyone's trying to weigh in with their individual thought that can spread. And it's like, sometimes it's better to just leave the thought unspoken.
I agree with that. It's anyway, social media is a whole other topic that could.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really interested in why I brought you on here today was, you write, you tell stories about climate. I'm curious, as an educator, specifically in design, how I can use not just your articles in my classroom, but what you've learned through your work in climate in the design classroom. Do Do you have any ideas about that?
Like for projects that you could work on?
Projects, yeah, that's what we do. We do projects.
Yeah, well, I have some ideas. I might need to launch into a little background first.
That's fine.
But one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is sort of what motivates people to take action. And I think it's a really, kind of hot topic in climate change circles. And it's also a difficult question because people respond differently to different things.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I found is that sort of the overall balance of stories that exist about climate change are very much on like the doom side of things. Like, these are the bad things that will happen. These are the bad things that are happening now. And, there are stories that are looking more at like solutions and like people grappling with this, but just that I find that the balance is off.
Yeah.
And
I see that too.
Yeah. And one of the, there's this sort of interdisciplinary neuroscientist who I've talked to a couple of times called Grist Magazine, who has really interesting ideas about, like looking at research showing what motivates people to take action. And a lot of the research in climate change communication has like focused on this idea that, we need to like use emotions as levers to get people to act. Like, oh, we need to inspire fear in people with these stories about doom, or, we need to make people feel hope so that they will be inspired to do something. And one thing that, Grist Magazine has found in research more broadly, not just related to climate change, is that like action actually inspires behavior. So or action inspires like, people to act,
right,
which is
they see it, they act.
Yeah. It's like once you think of yourself as a vegetarian, it's suddenly like, oh, like I of course I don't eat meat. It's like this sort of switch of, seeing things in front of you, seeing people take action. So I'm trying to focus more on like those social things. But one thing, and this is what comes back to your design question, that Grist Magazine talked about, is that there's sort of this like laundry list of how to take action that people refer to, where they'll say, you should go to a protest, you should eat less meat, you should bike instead of drive. And that this is like, these are all really often really hard things for people to do. And like, there's sort of this endless laundry list that's really overwhelming to people.
Yeah. Seen that one.
Yeah. It doesn't grapple at all with like, what if I have to drive because I live in rural Indiana and like, there isn't good infrastructure, or, all of these things. And so Grist Magazine talked about how we need like recipes for taking action. And so this is kind of an out of the box design idea. I really love cooking, so maybe I just love recipes baking, for that reason.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. But I love the idea of like this metaphor of recipes for action that have these actual in-depth like steps. So, I guess it could be something like, your students could interview someone they know that's like changed something in their life, like a habit or something else because of climate change or sustainability or, some other cause. And then they could ask them about, what were all the ingredients that made this possible? Like, what were all the steps involved in, changing this habit? And like, what were the parts that were hard? And then they could like take that and format it and design a recipe. Like, here are the ingredients for, how to change an unsustainable habit. Like, here are the steps, here are these like tips and recipe notes. And I mean, I think it'd be interesting because like, these are focused on individual responsibility, like these questions of like, oh, I need to fly less or things like that. But they're also, I think, with like driving and meat and other things, I think people will discover that there's these like systematic issues that like underlie these, that, the way that the world is designed right now makes it really hard, if like not impossible, for people to do the right thing that we're always talking about that they should do. Yeah. So I think it could be kind of inspiring to see like how people have overcome these obstacles in reality. Because I mean, I think the reality is that like people who are relatively well off in the world will have to change a lot of things about their lifestyle in the coming years. Yeah. And it's like, we need more information about how to actually do this, and more incentives to actually make it happen.
Yeah, I think we do, because if the pandemic is any insight into that, right? People don't like being told what to do, right? Wear a mask. And
right.
There was like nearly a violent revolt against that. And we need to have a better way of telling people what to do without them making them feel like they're being told what to do, to be a part of the kind of collective action that's necessary. That's been my takeaway from the past 2 years.
Yeah, I do think it's how do we make these changes in a way that doesn't come across as a sacrifice to people? And maybe another project idea would be, take a city block that exists and how do you design it in ways that both are good for the climate and would also make people happier and healthier? Do research on mental health and, happiness and health. And, how can you design a city to maximize happiness and address climate change at the same time? You could look at driving, walking, biking, community factors, and just take the city block and subtract things and add things and make it a car-free zone. I don't know. There's a lot of options for how. I don't know. That would take some work, but that would be kind of fun.
Well, that's what the students need to do. They need to work. Yeah. Well, let's take a break here for a few commercial messages, and we'll be right back.
Looking to take your industrial design career to the next level? For over 50 years, the Industrial Designers Society of America has worked to advance the practice of industrial design and enrich the professional lives of members. Join IDSA today for professional development and continuing education for each stage of your career, exclusive discounts on events and award programs, access to members-only content, community leadership opportunities, and much more. Go to idsa.org/JOIN for more information and use code JOIN25 to save $25 on a new professional membership.
Where do young designers see themselves at the intersection of climate change and innovation, and how can we teach that intersection in the classroom? Designers are problem solvers, capable of imagining solutions for a more sustainable future. We have a bigger role to play in all phases of the design process, not just the beginning. My name is Rachel Cifarelli, graphic designer, recent college grad, and part of the Climate Designers EDU team. And after graduating, I realized today's classrooms tend to skip over that universal side of design. So if you're a design educator, I want to hear from your students. Help set in motion the first ever project that centers students at the intersection of design education and climate change. I want to know what your students think about sustainable design, how they see climate change impacting their future careers, and what even comes to mind when they hear the term climate design. Send your students to climatedesigners.org/edu/New Wave Survey to take the 5-question survey or sign up for an interview with me. Help me inform a new wave of design education, one that teaches every designer how to be a climate designer.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Still here with Kate Yoder. And we're going to be talking more now about some of the themes that I was hoping to address here in the second season. And that is dealing with storytelling and voices that need to be part of the action for our climate crisis. So, Kate, I'm interested in as a storyteller yourself and a reporter working in climate, what do you think needs to be done differently in journalism, in the media, or just how the people who are knowledgeable in this area are talking to the public about that, the necessary actions that we need to take?
I think that we definitely need to hear more stories of action and more stories of solutions, which are definitely present. There's stories, looking at these topics, but they often just in the overall balance of things aren't really what's getting through to people, or are just underrepresented. I don't think it's like, oh, we shouldn't tell stories about all the bad things that are happening and that will come, because I think that needs to be there.
Yeah,
Yeah, we need to know. But I do think there needs to be sort of more of a roadmap of how people are talking about like what needs to change and also what's already changing, because I think there's always a sense of like, we'll never have done enough on climate change because we're already at this point where the climate has changed and things are bad. Or like,
yeah.
But the question is really like, how catastrophic does it get? And, the fact is we've already avoided some of like the very like worst off catastrophic scenarios. And I don't think people really talk about
good
that.
News. Yeah, no, we need to talk about that we avoided like apocalyptic.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, we still might have the apocalypse, but at least like less of one, you know what I mean?
Okay.
And like, if you're not acknowledging like, wow, renewable prices have come down and like, like there's this wholesale like change in the industry, like around sustainability, even though there's still a lot of greenwashing. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just, there needs to be more of an acknowledgement of the good things that are happening, or else people will think that nothing is happening and that, the work that they've already done isn't making a difference.
Yeah. Have you found like with action-oriented writing or examples, have you found any that really inspired you to change actions or habits that you've done or you have as a person?
That's a good question.
Because I was thinking about it too, like personally, like what have I changed based on what I know I have?
Yeah. I think often for people, the easiest things to change are the ones that you're like somehow already predisposed to do. So for me, it's like, I never liked meat that much. So becoming vegetarian was easy. Driving made me super anxious. So I moved to a city where I don't need to own a car and can take public transit almost everywhere I need to go. I think those are like the easy things to change. And then the hard parts are like things that don't come naturally to you. Like I'm not naturally an activist, but I will go to a protest occasionally. But I think there's a sense of like, you need your friends to bring you along with you in that.
Yeah.
Because
I'm the same way.
Like different people have different strengths. And I think we really need to lean into those.
I think introverts are tougher to get out there, like myself, on the protest line.
Yeah, you might have guessed I'm an introvert already, but just like crowds of people in generally. Yeah, crowds of people in general, like that makes me a little anxious. So, it's not like I wouldn't do it, but I definitely need a push.
Right.
Yeah.
That friend, right. Yeah. I'm thinking too, like the idea of action, like action examples. For me, it's hard to think of one because I think I've been doing it for so long. I just sort of consider it like, hey, this is just my habit now. But the one like tiny thing, which probably is a big thing, is just like energy conservation. I saw friends, investing in better refrigerator as an example, or I'm a homeowner. So I knew people who were doing better insulation in their attics as an example. And I thought, it's going to cost me a little bit of money, but I feel like I'm going to save some money. And hey, it's a double whammy because I can also reduce my carbon emissions of my home. So, so anything around energy, I think I've been very action oriented on.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And
I wonder if it had to do with like money too, because I think it was like, I was convinced already from the environmental side, and then that money saving side was the other side of it was like seal the deal. Like I'm gonna do this.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting how sort of like incentives and habits play into the decisions we make. Like if action means like exerting willpower every time you like encounter a stake, like that's going to be really difficult.
Yeah.
Like I think it's like, having the right incentives there and having habits built up where you're not thinking about it. Like that's the place we need to get to. Right.
Yeah, it is. And I'm thinking more now about this because I remember like doing some volunteer work. That's another thing that's action oriented for me, is that I saw people volunteering and I'm like, okay, I'll volunteer. It was a little bit, I needed a push, but I did. And I was doing more like letter writing and texting, text bases, what do they call it? Text banks. And
Right.
it was all about climate, and they were telling me like, never mention climate change, but talk about the other benefits of the action. So you will save $300 a year doing this, or something like that, because their research showed that the more you talked about the other benefits of making a climate action, that other people would be more inclined to also do it. But if you just mention like, you'll reduce your greenhouse gases, which is somewhat like vague and you don't really see that happening.
Right.
It's not as much of an incentive.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely think the ways that we can make, climate action, it's like for some people, like that is enough. And for other people, for political reasons or financial reasons or whatever, they need different incentives.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's important to talk about those too.
Yeah, it's like, what about me? What am I getting out of this?
Yeah.
You'll live longer, maybe. So
yeah.
The other thing that has been on my mind since for a while and came up last season was not just about telling the story of climate change, but a little bit of the rebranding of it. And I'm wondering what your thoughts about that is. Do you think we need to do that? And if so, how would rebrand climate change?
I think that's like the $1 million question, right?
Yeah, it is. It is.
I will say, well, I have a lot of thoughts about this because I cover language and terminology, and like linguistics is one of my favorite subjects. I think the key here is that you're going to reach different people with different messages. So it really depends what you want to accomplish. Like, I think, the term climate justice, for example, has like emerged in recent years. And I think that really speaks to like progressives and marginalized groups, and it's sort of this activist side that's like about the Green New Deal, and has this sort of like imagining how do we like structure society better and tackle climate change at the same time. But on the other hand, if you like say tree equity or like climate justice to like a Republican politician, they're going to be like, I need to tell Fox News about this so that we can run a segment to like make you look crazy. So it's like, I've looked at, for example, red states that have passed climate legislation, like actual legislation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And, you're a lot better using a word like extreme weather, or, looking at, how do we increase economic opportunity for, renewable businesses, and all these other questions where you're reframing, like it's still a true framing of the situation that like, yeah, we need to prepare communities for extreme weather, but it's one that like will be a lot more likely to pass in like, Georgia or Utah or all these other places. Yeah, I do think that, I've done some research on like the terms climate crisis and climate emergency, which have been popping up in more recent years. And there was like some initial research that showed like maybe this like is, gets people more like interested. And, I think the idea behind it is like, we need to tell like a fairer account of what's actually happening. Whereas global warming has been criticized for sounding too nice, and climate change has been criticized for, sounding even better than global warming, because it's like kind of neutral, like, oh, it's just changing. It's always been changing. It's fine. It's fine. Like that was used by, like the George Bush administration, like intentionally.
Wasn't that George Bush, one of his like advisors?
Yeah, Frank Luntz.
Don't say global warming. Yeah, him.
Yeah, and Frank Luntz actually has recommendations for like how climate communicators should actually talk, like to help people care. So it's interesting he's sort of come around.
He did like a 180 or something on that.
Yeah, yeah. But what was I gonna say? Oh yeah, so the research on like climate crisis and climate emergency, Like the most recent study I've seen about it shows that it really didn't make much of a difference, which I think is important to remember. Like if we're rebranding climate change, we can't just change the name of it and expect people to like suddenly act differently or suddenly take it more seriously. I do think that if it was like a wide scale change where everyone was talking about climate change as if it were a crisis, not just saying climate crisis, I think that could create a change in people. Yeah. And there's definitely like different connotations. There was one study showed that news organizations that use the word climate emergency in their pieces were seen as less credible by readers, maybe because they were seen as less biased or as more biased or something like that. So yeah, there are like a lot of, small things that happen when you use a particular word just because of its color and connotation or, political associations. But overall, I think that in terms of how do we rebrand climate change, I think it's just talking more about the specifics of what you're trying to accomplish as the climate movement. We so often say like, oh, address climate change. And like, what does that really mean? It's so broad. Are you trying to stabilize the climate? Are you trying to like protect your community from extreme weather? One of my pet peeves, and this is because I come from a pacifist background, but I hate the war on climate change. Yeah. I think it's really broad. I think it doesn't really make sense because you can't fight climate change. Like you need to work with the climate, right?
Yeah, you're going to lose if you fight it. It's gonna.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to lose against the climate. So yeah, instead talking about like, we're trying to keep the planet habitable for everyone, or just like stating the actual goal, like what you want to see, and not just like climate change is bad, address it.
Yeah, I like that idea of like the goal, like what kind of world do you want?
Right. Yeah. Just like naming your vision. I like that. What kind of world do you want?
Yeah. And that definitely brings up the topic of who gets to say what world we want. Right. And there's a lot of voices left out of the conversation historically on this. And there definitely is a need for those most affected, those marginalized in our world to have a voice and on the climate movement. And I'm kind of stuck on how to make sure that we get more people like those who haven't had their voices heard thoughts about or solutions to increase the amount of people in the movement or have their voices be heard more.
I don't know. I think it's a really hard question because it's like
totally hard. It's
who is doing the inviting? Like
exactly.
How do you, it's like maybe these conversations are already happening and
we just don't know.
Yeah. And you just don't know. And like, maybe it's if people are asking these questions, I would say like, maybe you need to ask questions first and like, hear what communities are really grappling with, or kind of meet people where they're at. And yeah, I don't know. I think the question of inviting is hard because it like assumes that there's like a group and then that there's outsiders. And it's like, how do we move these outsiders? It's like, maybe we need to move toward the outsiders, or, I do think too, that just like, I think having a broad coalition is really good, but there's often a lot of divisions within a coalition. And
of course,
it's just hard to, you can't like appease everyone at the same time, but at the same time, like, making the planet more livable helps everybody. So like, how do you do that? I don't know.
Oh, yeah. Well,
I do. Yeah.
You're so right on that too. Cause like the word invitation means it's like your party, come on over.
Yeah. Like right? RSVP, please.
Right. Join us.
Yeah.
We caused the problems, but come on over. Yeah. And help us fix our mess.
Yeah. I think as far as invitations that are helpful, it's like, not only do, like underrepresented sorry, that word, not only do underrepresented groups, need to be invited into more conversations, but it's like be invited into conversations where these decisions are actually getting made about like local policy. And, one of my coworkers wrote a piece about like Indigenous voices at the UN and how you not just be present at the UN, but actually be like a key part of the decision-making process. And so I think that, younger people, like Indigenous people, people with disabilities, all of these groups, they need to be part of the decision-making process at like all levels of policy making, because that's, where they can actually have the most sway.
Yeah. So I think in that perspective, like those who are at that table, we'll call it a table, decision makers need to flex their power, I guess, and invite, there's the word again, I don't mean to say invite, but to bring those people to your level.
Right. Yeah. They can be elected. They can, I don't know exactly how it would work, but it needs to happen. Right.
It does. Yeah. And I'm trying to figure it out. That's this season.
Yeah.
We're going to figure that out somehow.
Yeah.
Right?
And then, as far as, in our personal lives, I know like social science research has shown that, at least on like people's opinions about climate change, the people that they're closest to, like their friends and family, have the most sway over like what they think and what they do. So I'd say sort of like, if you want to make a difference and reach out to people, like focus on your friends and family and your local community, like people you already have a connection with and have some like shared understanding and rapport. And just like, don't like belittle people who don't think like you do, like ask questions. I know like there are a lot of environmental movement slogans that like I kind of cringe at, like, listen to the science is one of them, because it's like almost used as a weapon. Like
it is.
I listen to the science and like you don't, and it like reinforces these divisions instead of like asking questions like, where does your skepticism come from? Or like, how can, like kind of getting to the root of these issues, which are, really hard to overcome in such a polarized environment, unless, like focus on the people in the middle or the people who are concerned but not acting. It's going to be really hard to try to convince someone who's like, hardcore, it's part of their identity to deny climate change. Like there's probably not a ton of headway you can make there, but you can make headway with other people.
Do you feel it's valuable still to try to reach out to those people that you mentioned, that it's just like part of their values? Like we are going to say, no, we're not going to take part in this movement.
I think so. There's always room for things to change, right? Like the Republican Party is, slowly, very slowly coming around to climate change on at least certain issues. I think it's important not to see identity as like set in stone, because it can change.
Yeah.
But also if you're just looking at like in terms of bang for your buck, in terms of effort, that's maybe not the place to start.
Right.
Yeah.
Very low yield in the end.
Yes. Yeah. Uh-huh.
No, I agree with that. I still have hope for everyone feeling that they can be part of a solution to a problem that is happening right in front of them.
Right. Mm-hmm. And it's always like, maybe if you don't use the word climate change, you can still, like it can still work.
I think there's some truth to that. I learned that from being part of that volunteer project I was on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well, we're almost out of time here, but I wanted to, you kind of answered this question, and it's one of my favorite questions to get an answer from, because you're not teaching design like I am. And so I think we get trapped in our own heads about what we should do. And I think having fresh eyes on what we're teaching in the classroom or how we're teaching can always help. So that's why I asked this question. And that if you were teaching a design class or a project around climate or action, what would you teach? What would be your scenario that you would work with the students on?
Like as a project or as a lesson
definitely
plan?
Back to the project. Well, it could. Okay. It could be a whole class. I'm totally fine with that.
Okay. If I were to teach a whole class, I think it would be on, what really motivates people to take action, because I think there's a lot of widespread ideas we have about why actually people take action that are just misplaced and wrong. And I mean, starting with the idea that, more information will like convince people like, oh, if you just learn more bad things about climate change, then like maybe then you'll take all of these steps to change your life. As I mentioned earlier, I think behavior is a lot more complicated than that. And we really need to look into like social dynamics, peer pressure, like how peer pressure can be used for good. Like using emotion like fear or anger or hope as a way to motivate change. Does that really work? Or is that just something we've been talking a lot that, like maybe an emotional response comes once you've already taken action, or, there are all these questions that I think need to be like investigated more thoroughly. And as far as specific projects, I talked a little bit earlier about, recipe cards for action, interviewing people who recipe cards for action, people who have made some change in their life, like someone that, preferably who can like really tell you all the obstacles they face to, install solar panels on the roof or anything like that, to kind of highlight both how, what are the specific ingredients that are needed? What are, all of the steps involved? What tips do people have that, you can do that, like what blog people do, where they write like a whole backstory to the recipe before you can finally even read what it is. I don't know. I think there's a lot of ways to go about designing a recipe for action, but just making sure that instead of like a laundry list of like, go to a protest, all this whole long list of things, that there's like specific steps that people are taking that kind of illuminate like the broader like systemic problems that are preventing most people from doing these things, even if they wanted to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially with like you said, specific things. So a specific thing may not require you to go to a protest, but there could, like you said, there's a recipe that you can follow to do that one particular action. And someone like me would be more excited about doing that, since I can just stay home and do it. Right. I can do something.
Right. Yeah. Maybe not all of us need recipes, but we all need like recipes for something, I guess.
Yeah. No,
that makes sense.
I also think from like the design perspective, it's an effective project because the designer is organizing. That's one of the things that we do. And they're going to have to organize a lot of information and distill it into what are the core things. This other stuff is important, but no, what is these core bits to the recipe? And obviously working with someone who's an expert in that would need to happen, right? But that's a really good skill for the designer. So
yeah, it's kind of a challenge too, right? It's like open-ended. Like, how do you turn this into a recipe? It's like, I don't know. I'll need to think about that, but I don't know. It's intriguing.
Like? Is it a recipe? Book? Is it what is this recipe card?
Just like one of my mom's handwritten recipe cards that like goes in the recipe box to be, pulled out.
Yeah, my mom had that too.
Yeah.
Now I
even go like retro. Yeah, a lot of options.
Yeah, I don't think I couldn't read cursive very well, so like it was never good for me to read my mom's recipe guides that she wrote.
Something about the character of handwritten recipes.
I think that's the thing that I had to learn cursive. I'm a Gen X. I don't know where you fall in there, but I had to learn cursive in school, but I was never good at reading it. My mom's was a lot more loopy, right? And I don't know.
I see. Yeah, everyone has their individual cursive. I'm a millennial and I learned cursive in school too, but
did you?
It takes me, I can read it. It just takes me a little while to parse,
Yeah. So what does these recipe cards for action look like? That's a perfect title for a project too, like recipe cards for action.
Yeah. I'm glad you like it.
One. Yeah. Well, Kate, it's been an honor to talk with you today. I appreciate all the work you're doing at Grist. It is important, even if you don't get tons of fan mail about it. I know people are reading it like me. Maybe I should have been sending you some letters of support, but people are reading your work, and I know it's doing some good.
Yeah, same to you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Looking forward to all the fan mail.
This podcast is written, produced, and engineered by me. Design by Bashul Rashik and Mark O'Brien, with music by Casual Motive. Next week on Climify, we're joined by Sadie Redwing, a Lakota designer based out of Ontario, Canada. Sadie's work is in Indigenous design knowledge, decolonization, and traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK.
Yeah, I want to go a little bit more deeper in talking about regeneration, land regeneration, soil regeneration, because what I'm wanting to do is to bring more terminology on reciprocity into design spaces. And I hope I'm not wrong saying this, is that in the community of design, it is still a huge trend to get everybody on board with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right.
And I think we're progressing in there where we're getting more inclusive in these spaces. And when I say I hope I'm not wrong saying that, the next trend coming up is, well, we got a solid team now. Now the next challenge is how to be more eco-friendly, how to be sustainable.
Yeah.
And I think in thinking about preparing for those conversations that are coming up, this is where Indigenous knowledge can excel. Yeah. It may not excel in other trending aspects, but we are definitely going to be needed in any conversation around land regeneration.
Thanks for listening to Climify. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. To catch all the latest on Climify, you can follow us on Instagram at Climify Podcast. Climify is part of Climate Designers. Learn more at climatedesigners.org/edu.